All right, good morning, everyone. My name is DJ Kumar, and welcome to Risk Management Professionals webinar series. My co-presenter, Stephanie Smith, is in the room with me, and she'll be jumping on midway. Our producers, Jasmine and Kareen, will be in the background, keeping us operational and taking questions. A few quick housekeeping items. We are using GoToWebinar. It's an interface to support our presentations. If there are any technical difficulties, feel free to contact our office at the 877 number that's listed on this slide. We have staff to help you with troubleshooting, and the image sizes for this presentation can be adjustable and are in PowerPoint. So we also have a dialog box for questions. So if you have any questions that come up during the presentation, feel free to type them in, and during the Q&A session, we will address them. Okay, so before we get into the presentation, I want to go over a quick overview of the company. Our company's been in business for over 20 years, and we specialize in many aspects of process safety and risk management, including RMP PSM submittals, conducting PHA and HAZOP studies, along with providing support for CalARP and CAP programs. I'm not going to go through the rest of the services here. They're all available on our website, so feel free to peruse as you see fit. Okay, so a quick summary of what we'll be covering today. We'll be covering three main topics. First, we'll get into exactly what the General Duty Clause states. We'll get into the key phrases and the specific language that's used by the EPA and OSHA. We'll break down the key phrases from these documents to help you understand exactly how it applies to you and what you can do to comply, and also briefly talk about the penalties that come up in case of noncompliance. Okay, so I'm going to quickly go over the exact verbiage from the EPA and OSHA. So from the Clean Air Act, Section 112, it states that the owners and operators of stationary sources producing, processing, handling, or storing such substances have a general duty to identify hazards which may result from such releases using appropriate hazard assessment techniques, to design and maintain a safe facility, taking such steps as are necessary to prevent releases and to minimize the consequences of accident releases which do occur. And from OSHA's General Duty Clause, Section 5, each employer shall, 1, furnish to each of his employees employment and a place of employment which are free from recognized hazards that are causing or are likely to cause death or serious physical harm to his employees, and 2, shall comply with the occupational safety and health standards promulgated under this Act. And secondly, each employee shall comply with the occupational safety and health standards and all rules, regulations, and orders issued pursuant to this Act which are applicable in his own actions and conduct. So what this kind of in general means, there's a separate quote that's pulled from a separate section of the EPA. All it states is that facilities have a general duty in the same manner and to the same extent as Section 654, Title 29 of the United States Code, which means that all owners and operators must comply with the General Duty Clause in the same manner, and to the same extent employers must comply with the Occupational Safety Health Act as administered by OSHA. So basically, every facility with chemicals listed on the EPA and OSHA should be looking at their compliance. So how is the General Duty Clause applied? First, it should be applied in compliance with OSHA and RMP regulations. And it's most specifically for facilities under the hazardous substance threshold quantities listed in the regulations. And OSHA does not include hazard assessments for reporting, which is why it's in the middle of this bubble right here. Okay, so what does this mean? All those fancy words basically just means that you're likely to get cited by the EPA and OSHA, regardless of whether or not you follow the RMP and PSM applicability. And you can apply to alternative program levels if more information is needed. And if you do get inspected, the citation is at the discretion of the inspector, meaning that if he feels that safe practices aren't being observed, then you're likely to get fined. And along the same lines, if there's a facility that has been regularly having some accidents, then it's more likely to be inspected and cited. So to go over the exact key phrases that are important from the quote that I mentioned earlier, for the EPA, the three things to consider are identifying hazards, designing and maintaining a safe facility, and minimizing consequences in the event that they occur. And from OSHA, all you have to really worry about is to be concerned with employee safety. So I'll get into that right away. Firstly, to identify hazards, EPA supplies specific questions that they look for when they do these assessments. And so for the guidance questions to identify hazards, they look to see if the PHA has been conducted by the facility, and specifically, is the PHA complete, accurate, and correct? Has it identified intrinsic hazards? Has it identified potential releases? And has it identified potential impacts to the community and environment? And also, they check to see if the facility is using proper hazard assessment techniques. Now, the solutions that the EPA states as the best way to address these issues is to obviously conduct a PHA or hazard review. You might want to look into considering the what-if analysis or a HAZOP study to look at the hazards that come with the process. And when you do the hazard assessment, make sure the worst case and alternative case scenarios are properly done. And if you're in California, make sure you take into account for the seismic assessment. And lastly, you can do internal audits to review maintenance programs and use established guidelines for reference. It's always best to avoid fix-it-failure practices, and you can determine if that's what's going on if you do an internal audit. Secondly, designing and maintaining a safe facility. The EPA questions that they look for are the design documents correct, accurate, and current? Does the design actually minimize the risks that are identified? Are the design codes identified and appropriate? Was the facility constructed or modified according to design specifications? Is there quality control on construction materials? Do critical process controls have redundant systems? Has the design been updated to current codes and standards? And are there capabilities for more remote monitoring or remote control during any upsets? So to address these issues, EPA recommends that you use the newest standards when possible. There are often some subtle changes in between versions that might be overlooked. So you should always use, you should also use applicable standards. Obviously, you want to use the most relevant standards that don't apply, and make sure you consider any local implications that might come into play. For the construction, you want to make sure you get a qualified contractor is brought to bring onto your facility to do any installations or any building. Make sure you have a detailed quality control program, and make sure you're thinking about sustainability and longevity. It'd be pointless to do anything without having those things in mind. And lastly, make sure that the remote capabilities are accessible if needed, as I mentioned before. Okay, so the maintenance aspect of designing and maintaining a safe facility, the main questions the EPA asks are the preventative maintenance procedures for mechanical integrity, excuse me. Do procedures and schedules follow generally accepted engineering practices, or RAGAGEP? Are maintenance personnel trained on the hazards of the process and maintenance procedures? Does training include understanding and proficiency evaluation? Are there sufficient supplies in the inventory? Is quality control for spare parts, is that sufficient? And how does the facility minimize the possibility of an unauthorized entry? So to address these issues, the EPA recommends that the preventative maintenance procedures should originate from manufacturers, industry best practices, or corporate practice if it's more conservative. And they always recommend to include RAGAGEP in your evaluation. They recommend that training should be up to date and has to be in the language of the user, so the employees need to be able to fully understand it. The inventory of spare parts should be adequate and readily accessible in the event that they're needed. And the quality control for the spare parts should include how they're stored and ensure the facility is secure. So I'm going to pass it off to Stephanie now. We'll go over a few more parts and wrap things up.
I'm just going to check. Jasmine, are we coming in okay? Okay. All right. Good morning. I'm going to go ahead and pick up where DJ left off and continue with the guidance questions for operations under the designing and maintaining a safe facility. Basically, these apply to SOPs primarily, although they can apply to other areas, say for maintenance or whatnot. We'll focus more on addressing the SOPs. The EPA, when they're looking at these general duty clause audits, will be asking whether or not there's an SOP for each process. It's really important to make sure that all those required SOPs for each process you have, or if necessary, different pieces of equipment are addressed. And are they current? Going back to those annual cycles that are required in the program, different program levels, for instance, program level 1 may not have that requirement. However, you may still want to have SOPs and follow that guideline to meet the general duty clause standards. Do the SOPs cover each phase of the process? Are they clear, concise, correct, and understandable? Do they identify operating limits such as temperature, pressure, flow rate, volumes, etc.? And do those limits agree as identified in the PHA or any other kind of studies or documentation associated with the process? Does a process equipment, are the process equipment clearly marked, labeled, etc., according to any established standards? IAR for the ammonia refrigeration industry is a largely referenced standard. So going back to the newest and latest standards, or in some cases are allowed corporate standards. Are the SOPs revised periodically? So not just reviewing them, but also revising them as necessary. It could be annual, could be more frequent than that. And especially one of their questions is, are they revised after any incidents or changes in the process? So some solution to this, again, we kind of talked about it in the previous slide, to maintain proper SOPs and training within your facility. Again, the general duty cause is regardless of program level. So if this is applicable to you, even as a program level 1 facility or a facility under threshold limits, this is important information to take into account, as you may still need this, especially if someone's coming over to audit you for general duty clause. Scheduling annual reviews of SOPs and ensuring that someone is responsible to do that and sign off on it. It could be that an operator is responsible for doing it, but a manager is responsible for overseeing that it gets done. It could be that a head maintenance operator is responsible for getting the entire thing done and signing off on it. It's really up to each facility for what kind of responsibilities they want to assign, but it does and should need to get done. Also, auditing SOPs for accuracy, completeness, and understandability. It's really important to make sure that all your SOPs are easy to follow. I usually use the rule, if someone can't walk into your facility fresh and follow a procedure, it's not good enough. Now, obviously, you never want to let anyone do that, but that's the kind of consistency and clarity you want in your procedures. Also, sometimes it helps, sometimes it doesn't, but you could consider adding in pictures of the control panels or where things are located to make it more clear. Some facilities don't find this helpful, some do, but it is something that you can always add in if it's useful. Nomenclature should always match. Tag numbers, PNIDs, any references to equipment, all the tag numbers and labels should match consistently across the board. Anything that doesn't or match or isn't consistent is technically considered non-compliance. Also establishing a process for updating SOPs, having a regular schedule. I've been at facilities where they audit everything and update everything in January. I've been at facilities that rotate quarterly for which SOPs they address and do training with the updates. So there's a lot of different ways to do this and to stay compliant, and it's really finding that mechanism that works for your facility. Also, under designing and maintaining a safe facility is training in the EPA guidance. So the EPA is looking at questions such as if the employees are trained and tested for competence in training. This can be addressed with either observation, oral quiz, written quiz, and a sign-in sheet. And so there's a number of different methods depending on what will work for your operators. Also, they ask if training is adequate. If employees are trained on the hazards of the process and the consequences of deviation, really understanding what the hazards are at the facility and what happens when something isn't going according to plan. Also, the frequency of training is something that the EPA is looking at, and whether or not it may need to be more frequent than 3 years as required in the RMP and OSHA requirements. Are instructions given in a clear manner and understandable? That also includes understanding in the language of the user or the operator. Are employees trained to recognize emergency situations, and are they authorized to take actions to prevent them or mitigate those hazards? And also, does training reflect any current operations? In order to address all these, obviously training should be understood and retention should be tested in some manner. I mentioned oral exam, the written exam, sign-in sheets, even an observation of whether or not the person understood, so perhaps either a maintenance procedure or a training procedure. There are lots of methods in order to get this material across and make sure it's understood. Also, operators and management should understand the hazards of system. Management should understand it at least as much as the operators do. And in addition, the consequences of deviation are very important. What happens when something can go wrong? Refresher training, again, I mentioned the 3-year mark. I have a lot of facilities that do training much more frequently than every 3 years, and it's necessary more frequently than 3 years just to keep everyone refreshed and up to date. And also knowing your emergency preparedness and procedures and having those coordinated, especially when you're talking about any kind of outside sources like the fire department, which we can talk about a little bit. You know, the fire department also has their hand in this, or if you have a local hazmat team, and all that should be coordinated and trained on with drills, exercises, tabletop, perhaps full-scale drills where they get fully dressed or whatnot. So there's a lot to work with the training. And then we go to our last key topic, which is minimizing consequences. This, in the EPA guidance for the inspectors, is really intended to minimize consequences to the community, but also to those on site. So do the hazard assessments identify potential release scenarios and potential impacts, both to the community and to people on site? Does the emergency response plan respond based on release scenarios? So do you have trained people, or do you have procedures based on what kind of scenario you have? Does the plan clearly identify responsibilities, functions, and contacts? Does the plan include coordination with local emergency responders? Again, talking to your local fire department or hazmat team. Are employees trained on emergency response actions? So not just those that may be responsible for preventing a more of an emergency after it's happened, but also just generally speaking, do your employees know to stay out of the way and evacuate or whatever the procedure is? Are employees trained to recognize emergency situations, and is a plan revised as the process changes? So again, hazard assessment and identification is really important here. Is there follow through on any recommendations from incident investigation, process hazard analysis, or just generally speaking if something's found to be deficient? And also, are the appropriate release scenarios used to address the hazard assessment and the modeling to properly address what could happen at the facility? Also, are there good safe practices, generally speaking, at the facility? Is that something that could be improved upon? Is there a good safety culture where employees feel that they can approach their management or the owners of the company and address issues as they come up? I can't emphasize that enough, just generally speaking, but also this is a good way to meet the general duty clause requirements. Also, employee involvement. Again, going back to that safety culture, but generally speaking, getting employees involved with procedure and element development for programs or additional elements you may need to bring in because of the general duty clause. Any kind of drills or walkthroughs that they are involved and they know what's going on and they know what their role is in any emergency. And also their involvement and coordination of local responders, giving everyone an opportunity to get to know those responders that may need to be there at some time. Incident investigation should always involve employees, generally speaking, especially those that are directly impacted by an emergency or by that incident. And also they should be involved with emergency procedures and planning at the facility. Again, going back to coordinating with local agencies, it really doesn't matter what state you're in. I know California requires this, but regardless of what federal requirements or other state requirements may say, it's important to know that those people that are responding from outside your facility should understand what's going on, should know where your king valve is, should know who to talk to, who's in charge, and where's the chain of command. All that should be brought in to coordinating with a local agency. So I wanted to talk a little bit about penalties, not to scare people, but to bring up what can actually happen if you're found deficient in general duty clause and why it's important. General duty clause is really applicable to those in the lower program levels or those that don't meet the threshold requirements but still use chemicals that are listed in Appendix A of the EPA regulation that's referenced in all of these regulations. The biggest thing for that is, and I've heard the argument, you have 1 pound of ammonia in a room, it could still put people in the hospital. So even though you're not meeting those threshold limits, you could still hurt people. And because of that, that's why the general duty clause exists, to make sure that you're at least following some minimum standards to maintain a safe operation at your facility. So it's important for everyone to understand the hazards of their chemicals, what may be applicable, where some facilities may not require as a robust a program for general duty to meet these audit requirements or to meet EPA's requirements. Others may have to do a little bit more, and so that's what we're trying to share here today. With the penalties, the least severe penalty EPA can bring up is basically fines. They'll issue an administrative penalty order. There were no monetary amounts listed in the regulations. I'm sure if you called them, they could disclose some of that information, but I'm assuming it's also up to those powers that be to establish how serious a violation is. Working down to more severe, they can bring a civil judicial action against a facility for the violations. Again, this would be a civil penalty, so it would not be criminal as the third bullet is. It would involve the Attorney General and criminal action. And the final and most severe penalty they can bring on is an order to abate danger or threat if the agency determines that there may be basically endangerment to anyone in the area. Generally speaking, that would probably be shutting down the operations of the facility. If it's that bad, they have the power to shut you down. So again, this is really important. General duty, while everyone knows this is a gray area and there's a lot of interpretation, we've provided the questions that they ask during inspections, and then the question for each facility is, do we meet these requirements? And if we don't, is there a reason why we don't? Maybe you don't have to do certain things because you're already meeting those requirements another way and just not specifically what's stated in the general duty inspection, but know that these questions actually come up in those inspections and they should be answered appropriately for the EPA not to issue violations. So with that, no one press the panic button just yet. First off, there are no established targets for these inspections. EPA is not running around thinking who we can pick on next. They're usually for cause inspections, so typically for facilities with chronic issues with safety, chronic incidents, and very regular occurrences of unsafe behavior or operations. The main concern is the facility's safe operation. So one-time incident, even if it's a large one, may not require an inspection like this or get triggered for an inspection like this, where a number of smaller incidents may. So it's really dependent on what the EPA is looking at. Again, because of the National Reporting Center, they do get this information. They can tell when there are chronic issues. They also base it on reports from the public and from local agencies. They're looking at the risk for the employees and the general public. The inspections are announced, so you will never just have someone show up and say, hey, I'm from the EPA, we're going to do a general duty clause inspection today. They will notify you. There is a period there where they have to give you for getting all your documentation together, and they will schedule a visit. So you will have some time to address issues as necessary and get all your documentation together. I don't recommend waiting until that point when you're notified, but you will have some allowance there. It won't be unannounced. And just to emphasize where this information and where the questions that the inspectors use are coming from, it is in the guidance for implementation of the General Duty Clause Clean Air Act, Section 112R1. That is the actual title. I wanted to give everyone the title of the guidance document. If you Google it, you can find it pretty easily in the EPA. If anyone wants a reference to the link, I'm happy to provide that. They want to email me after, or email producer after, we can send that out. But it gives you the answers to the questions. It gives you exactly what the inspectors are looking for. So I highly recommend at least reviewing those questions and, generally speaking, looking over the document. Our upcoming webinars. We have a webinar next week, a week and a half, about a week and a half, on the NFPA 86 and API 550, sorry, I'm reading this off the screen, 558, for safety standards for gas-fired heaters. I don't know how applicable it is to this demographic that's listening today, but that will be available in a week and a half. Also, we have a scheduled webinar in January. We're working on our 2018 schedule. So right now, that's the only one we have for next year, but that will be common MOC and PSSR deficiencies. that would be helpful for this group. If you're looking at general duty clause and you're wondering how to keep up with your requirements and keep up with deficiencies or how to improve your program, looking at common deficiencies of certain elements in the PSM or RP, even if you aren't required to meet those regulations, would be helpful, may help you decide whether or not you should develop something like that for your facility. We have a workshop coming up in Torrance. We're partnering with the Torrance Fire Department on it so I'm being told January 23rd. We just set the date. We'll be getting more information out via email, so stay tuned for that. It is a local workshop. We have regulators coming over to talk about a variety of topics, and we'll be getting an agenda together. I know it's in the development right now. Also in March, we will be attending the IAR National Conference in Colorado Springs. We will be exhibiting there for the first year. We're really excited about it. And also I'll be giving a presentation while I'm there as well. So I hope that those of you that attend can stop in. And in April, we will be going to GCPS and exhibiting there. No word yet on who may or may not be speaking, but we will at least be exhibiting there in April. That's the outlook for the first few months of the year. We'll be getting more webinars together in the next few weeks now that we're coming down for the holiday season and can look at the next year a little bit more closely. So stay tuned, or if anyone has any suggestions for topics or an extension of a topic they've heard before, please let us know. We're always taking suggestions, and we do have topics we try to recycle to make sure that everyone gets this information regularly. And with that, I'll bring DJ back up, and we'll go ahead and open it up for questions.
Great. The first question is, what facilities need to watch out most for citations?
So facilities that are either Program 1 or Program 2 that don't need a PHA are most likely to get cited. And also any facilities that have toxic chemicals under the regulated thresholds, they're also likely to be inspected out of the remainder.
And then the next question is, what is the difference between RAGAGAP and the general duty clause?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So general duty clause and RAGAGAP they kind of go hand in hand. They have a close relationship in that practicing one and adhering to one will help you adhere to the other. While certain facilities don't require RAGAGAP requirements, it's always best to utilize both these practices together. That way the general duty clause is obeyed. And if you do practice RAGAGAP, most likely you'll cover the basis for the general duty clause.
No, I think just reemphasizing that they are related, but they're not the same thing, and that the general duty clause is really for those lower program levels.
Okay, next question is, how do you recommend documenting worst case and alternative worst case scenarios from the RMP submittal in PHA studies?
In PHA studies, it's pretty easy, just bring it up. If you've already done the hazard assessment to address the worst case and alternative case scenarios, just documenting that as a potential cause and the consequences associated with that. So looking at the requirements, for EPA, the 10-minute full vessel release, what happens during that release? Worst case scenario, developing that consequence, and bringing in those safeguards and what's established there. So same as anything else you would do in a PHA, you would just bring those in after you've done the hazard assessment, because it's all part of the same process.
All right, it looks like that is all of the questions.
All right, well, thank you very much for attending. It was nice and short and sweet this morning. The audio and PowerPoint presentation is being recorded and will be available within the next few days. Anyone who has any questions after the fact can always email us here, and we'll go ahead and get some answers out to you. Thank you.